Hello everyone and welcome to this final talk in the Faith in the Time of COVID series. My name is Matt, I work with the Archdiocese. Our speaker today is the Right Honourable Gordon Brown. He is a former Prime Minister and the longest serving Chancellor in modern history. He was for many years an MP in our Archdiocese, based in our Archdiocese, where he still lives and works in West Fife. He is UN Special Envoy for Global Education, working to increase opportunities for young people across the world. Gordon kindly agreed to do this talk earlier today, so we're going to share that with you now. And if you have a question for Gordon, he'll be here in person afterwards, and you can put that question to him using the Q&A button.
Let me first of all congratulate the Archdiocese on organising this series of talks on such an important question, what faith can achieve in the time of COVID. And I'm conscious I have a very hard act to follow coming after three very eloquent and successful lectures. Let me thank Archbishop Cushley for his invitation, and let me say how pleased I am that he has recovered fully from his own personal crisis with COVID. Let me also thank someone to whom I owe a great deal, who has been a mentor to me, Professor James Gallagher, who was struck down with heart problems some weeks ago, but now after a long period in hospital is back with us in this virtual assembly today. And let me start also by acknowledging the inspiration I've drawn for this short talk from the book published only a few weeks ago by the Holy Father, Pope Francis, Let Us Dream the Path to a Better Future. It's a remarkable testament from a remarkable religious leader. While I've not been fortunate enough to meet him, although I count it as one of the great privilege I've enjoyed to meet Pope Benedict, I have read his book and his recent encyclical, and I feel as if I know him, and he is leading us all in this discussion of the role of faith in a crisis. Pope Francis builds on a foundation of Catholic social teaching going back a long way. Ever since the Industrial Revolution brought an end to agrarian and often feudal economies, Catholic social teaching has responded to seismic changes in our world, responding to industrialization 130 years ago, rerum novarum, on the condition of labor and the working classes. It engaged with the social consequences of the Industrial Revolution. It carried a demand for decency. Its analysis remains as striking today as it was then, when it said a small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the teeming masses of the laboring poor a yoke little better than that of slavery itself. And amidst the miserable conditions faced by the new industrial working classes came a demand for what was called frugal comfort, that remuneration must be enough to support the wage earner in reasonable and frugal comfort, something we must remember today. And I know this influenced the early Scottish trades unions and labour movements, perhaps even before it was influential elsewhere in the United Kingdom and in Europe. Then in the 1960s, Pacem in Terris called for disarmament, and then came Populorum Progressio, which addressed decolonization and the end of imperialism, and it inspired men and women I know like Gracia Rochelle, the widow of Nelson Mandela, and others who became important agents for change in Latin America, Asia, and in Africa, with Mandela and the ANC as leaders of decolonization too. And I know from working with remarkable people here in Scotland for some years now, how much you through SCIAF have created strong post-colonial links with these countries. More recently, Laudato Si dealt unflinchingly with the new crisis, threats from global warming, and the need for swift and unified global action on it. And I think we can sum this up and agree that the greatest movements for social change in history, 200 years ago, the abolition of slavery, 150 years ago, the emancipation of the working classes, 100 years ago, the fight for women's rights, 50 years ago and since, the fight for the rights of the disabled and indeed all minorities have been built on ethical foundations inspired by men and women of religious faith. So when we talk about faith, let me say that you should be proud that it's your church and faith groups that created the momentum in recent decades and the mass crowds for the Band-Aid campaign, the Jubilee Debt campaign, the Make Poverty History campaign, answering in a modern way the injunction of Isaiah that we should loose the chains of injustice and let the oppressed go free. And you should be prouder still that your efforts change the world, and that because of your voice, there are men, women, and children whose names you will never know and whose faces you will never see, but who are alive today, are being educated today, are in work today, enjoy health and a cleaner environment today because of what you have done. Every day, through both your work in the field and the generosity of your contributions, you show by your faith, by both example and inspiration, the good that can result when people of moral purpose come together and work for shared objectives. So Catholic teaching has addressed industrialization and brought to bear our Christianity in faith, its teaching and its values on the arms race, decolonization, environmental degradation. And now it has to address the great dominant issue that has been made more prominent by COVID-19, globalization. As the Pope does with Fratelli Tutti, the Church addressing the very issues which confront our global society today, for economic globalization, which I define as global, not just national flows of capital, global, not just national sourcing of goods and services, has not only brought more contact, more travel, more tourism, cheaper foreign-produced goods from phones to T-shirts, but clearly also its connectivity, and by the increased interdependence it brings about, has accelerated the spread of a virus around the world and a recession across every country. And the question now is, can that same connectivity and that mutual interdependence now be mobilized for the best of purposes? And it will depend, as I will say, on whether we manage globalization well or badly. In Fratelli Tutti, Brothers All, the Pope champions fraternity and friendship as a necessary complement to liberty and equality. He says, without the we of a people, of a family, of institutions, of a society that transcends the I of individual interests, life becomes a battle for supremacy between factions and interests. And I feel this was summed up in the report of the conference call between the Pope and Joe Biden, the new US president, when the president, and I quote from his statement, expressed his desire to work together on the basis of a shared belief in the dignity and equality of all mankind on issues such as caring for the marginalized and poor, addressing the crisis of climate change, and welcoming and integrating immigrants and refugees into our communities. A call for solidarity that's been repeated in other churches, like the Orthodox Church, and towards the social ethos of the Orthodox Church endorsed by Bartholomew I, which states that our spiritual lives cannot fail to be social lives. The early Byzantine Church had a bold voice, it says, on social justice. This, it states, must be revived and renewed. And before I add some thoughts about how men and women of faith can build on these injunctions to action, let me be clear, I'm not going to be party political in any way. I grew up as the son of a minister, baptized into the faith, raised in the faith, listening twice every Sunday to sermons explaining the faith. I could not fail to be influenced by religious teaching, and I was strongly influenced by my father's social Christianity, the ethic that no one should walk by on the other side. But my father also recognized there were men and women of different political convictions in his congregation. He was careful to tell me about the risks of preaching in favor of one political viewpoint in preference to another. He stressed the practical benefits of showing respect for the views and wisdom of everyone. A colleague of his had another way out. The Sunday after the election in which his favored party had won, he could not help himself. He would announce the first hymn as "Now Thank We All Our God." If the opposing party won, he would call for the hymn, "Dear Lord and Father of mankind, forgive our foolish ways." And if a third party fared well, it would be "God moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform." Our faith teaches us that no one should assert God is on their side for their own partisan reasons, nor claim some moral superiority because of the faith. And we've certainly come a long way from the 1920s and 1930s when a predecessor of mine as Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, drafted most of his speeches by hand before sending them to his office staff. And he would regularly inscribe in his own writing on the margins of the page the phrase, "refer to AG." And upon seeing these notations, conscientious civil servants duly sought the advice of the Attorney General, AG, about the legal propriety of the relevant language. Invariably, the Attorney General replied he had nothing to add. And only after many months did the civil servants realize that this was Baldwin leaving an aide-memoire for himself, that as he gave the speech, he should with great regularity invoke as inspiration and sustenance for his argument, AG, Almighty God. But those who invoke God on their side are in a way misusing religion. We cannot and should not claim God is on our side, but only hope, as Lincoln said, Abraham Lincoln said, that we are on God's side. So with some humility, we have to approach the task of thinking, what role do people of faith have when dealing with this crisis? We cannot impose our faith on others. We have to persuade people of what we think is right by using tools of reasoning around which a consensus can be built, and which contrast, of course, with the fake news and false truths of the social media. And in many ways, this is exactly what Pope Francis is doing in Fratelli Tutti. Rather than make dogmatic pronouncements of solutions to complex problems, he consciously reaches out to people of goodwill inside and outside the Christian community. So what role can faith play? Faith undoubtedly helps us respond to suffering and loss. All of us will know someone who has brushed with death during this crisis. Most of us has lost someone whom we knew and were close to, or who is related to us. Our critics, from agnostics to atheists, say that this consolation and comfort is all that religion offers. You'll notice, like me, that after a murder or a flood or a calamity in a town or city which has led to loss of life, BBC or ITV cameras will go to the nearest church on the Sunday afterwards, picture people going into church, report simply that prayers were said, perhaps playing back a sentence or two of the prayers from the priest. And it was as though the church was there to soften the blow without any explanation of why. And yes, religion can be described as something there for us to hold on to when things go wrong. But religion offers those of us who have come face to face with unexpected tragedy more than consolation or comfort. It builds a sense of community, and it inspires us to counter worldly trends towards individualism and isolationism. The fact that our faith gives us purpose to contribute and to belong has been acknowledged by well-known agnostic philosophers like Jürgen Habermas, who, after a lifetime putting forward the most rational argument for secular liberalism, came to the conclusion that politics, stripped of faith, is quite unable to inspire people to bridge the gap between the world we have and the world we can build. Talking of the motivational weakness of liberal states, he argues that they are unable to inspire virtuous acts and suggests that among the modern societies, only those that are able to introduce into the secular domain the essential contents of the religious tradition, which point beyond the merely human realms, only those will be able to rescue the substance of the human. He has understood that we are human beings who at our best can not only feel the pain of others, but can believe in something bigger than ourselves. And in two ways, at home here in our own country, we can understand that too much individualism and not enough concern for the community well-being damages us all. And when we look abroad, we can see that isolationism and protectionism that cuts across the best in human nature prevents us cooperating with others to the benefit of all. And this has come home to us in a dramatic way with the impact of COVID. I would say that before COVID, I'll call it another BC. Before COVID, we put the rights of the individual on a pedestal at the expense of our obligations to our communities, despite the fact that we are members of families and groups shaped by our cultures and histories, and we're all embedded in a larger whole. The balance had swung away from the collectivism of the post-war years to a new individualism that manifests itself in many forms: libertarianism, self-interest, the rejection of deference, suspicion of authority, the erosion of trust, the exhaustion of social capital, and generally a tendency to think not so much of what is best for the community or the public good, but what is best for ourselves. At the turn of the century, one major American academic study described people as bowling alone. By 2021, millions were alone and not even bowling. But being physically isolated in the 2020s, as it seems, made us more aware of the benefits of contact and communication. We have discovered that we depend on each other more than we thought, that we value what is rooted and close to home more than the distantly networked. Being alone and being free to be ourselves within a culture that once elevated personal autonomy now seems less attractive than a culture that encourages cooperation, celebrates reciprocity and the generosity of others. The celebration of Christmas brought this home. For most families, the burning issue was how they could come together, not what presents they received. By indicating we prefer to cultivate and embed a sense of community over that hyper-individualism, we now be able, after all, to say that there is indeed such a thing as society. For millions have found we cannot feel happy when so many are sad. We can't be at ease when so many are ill at ease. We can't be comfortable when millions go without comfort within a world in which rights and responsibilities are not distributed according to what we think are morally acceptable standards. We cannot feel at ease living a life of spiritual meaningless when we allow wrongs to go unrighted, evils to go unpunished. So I think we can build a new consensus around a new social contract across the generations and social classes that respects those who work hard with little reward, values all those who undertake public service, especially those who put their lives on the line in lowly paid jobs that we now see are vital to our very survival, and ensure a fair distribution of rewards that you can unite us as a country. And I think we're also more ready to acknowledge now that it's not anti-wealth to say those with wealth have a duty to help the not so wealthy, not anti-business and anti-enterprise to say that those who have succeeded in enterprise have a duty to help those who have not had the same chance to show they are enterprising. Eventually, each country will, of course, find a way forward as it rebalances the relationships between individuals and communities, between markets and states, between risk and security, between freedom and control, and between the very rich and the rest, and of course, between man and the environment. But what of the global challenges we share in common? What of the relations between nations as we seek to address them? For there is an overarching problem, perhaps the greatest long-term challenge thrown up by COVID. As the Pope has acknowledged in his encyclical, how well or badly we manage our increasingly interconnected world, and thus the fate of globalization. BC, before COVID-19, we tolerated and indeed indulged a standoff between globalists and nationalists, without admitting that what economists call spillovers from nation to nation can include not only climate change, nuclear proliferation, financial instability, but also, of course, the spread of disease across borders. Most of us felt it was of little consequence to our daily lives that movements like America First, China First, India First, Russia First, My Tribe First had descended into America First and only, My Tribe First and only, and that they were sabotaging attempts at international cooperation. And at the start of 2020, we were slow to see that a pandemic knows no boundaries, has no respect for political frontiers, and to understand that if a pandemic crossed borders, so too must the response to it. We saw nations that were suffering from exactly the same virus, being laid low by exactly the same economic recession, requiring the same medical supplies, needing to cooperate to get the virus under control, but governments that failed to draw the logical conclusion that to protect ourselves locally, we attack globally, together, in unison. Because of the long-term inadequacies of international cooperation, we were ill-prepared for the disease. No global early warning systems worth the name, no adequate exchange of information between countries until too late, little or no global reserve supplies of drugs and even protective equipment of the size and the scale needed to cope with the disaster, no internationally agreed rules that in practice forced offending states to take immediate remedial action, and instead of coming to each other's aid by transferring life-saving equipment to those that needed it most, countries responded to the crisis by hoarding drugs, hoarding medical supplies, even when they did not need them, and even when they knew that by making them more widely available, thousands of lives could have been saved. Worse, they closed borders to prevent life-saving equipment and drugs getting through to those who needed them. And even now, despite worthy international agreements to share vaccines, vaccine nationalism and medical protection seem to override what is in all our interests, the pooling and the sharing of resources to ensure that all are protected and all are vaccinated. Even when we have to recognize that every country is dependent on each other, that we cannot finally eradicate the disease in our own country until it's finally eradicated in all countries. Even if we recognize that if we don't help the poorest countries, we risk second, third, and fourth waves of disease spreading out from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East across the world, still many countries have been reluctant to conclude that we have no alternative but to fund the vaccination of the poorest countries in the world. And so vaccine nationalism hurts us all. Protectionism in medical equipment damages everyone. And it's only when you stand back to reflect on the scale of the disaster, the thousands of avoidable deaths, that you can begin to truly understand the colossal scale of our failure to work together to protect lives, to vaccinate everyone on the planet. To do so by the end of this year would not be an act of charity from rich to poor countries. It would be an act of forward defense of national self-interest on everybody's part. Because the longer this disease circulates at this scale, the greater the possibility of mutation and the risk of a more deadly variant. Now, for a time a few months ago, the issue was how to find a vaccine. But scientific genius and cooperation, to their great credit, has allowed scientists in the world to make it available in just 1 year. Today, the issue is reported as the lack of manufacturing capacity. But that too, you know, is a soluble problem. We can ramp up production everywhere. Nor is the long-term blockage to mass vaccination logistics. We can distribute vaccine to every part of the world. The biggest barrier to immunizing all people is how we fund the mass vaccination of the world and who is going to pay. And so I leave you with this thought. Yes, you and I should donate where we can to help charities that are working to pay for the vaccination of the poorest people in the world. But the best we can currently hope for under a great organization, COVAX, is that we have enough funds to vaccinate only 20% of the people in the poorest countries in a year's time. So I would like us to come together more urgently to draw up a plan to ensure every country has access to vaccine and cures. We can fund the immunization program. It will cost 30 billion a year, but to do so, we need countries to agree on an equitable system of burden sharing on the basis of their wealth and their capacity to pay. And I have a proposal also that maximizes the use of all too limited and recently reduced aid budgets by the public sector mobilizing private finance so that for every $1 billion of expenditure, we can deliver $5 billion of resources. To draw up a plan to fund the vaccination of the world would not only continue the honorable work of SKIA and other great global charities, it would represent in our time the aspirations of the Sermon on the Mount. It would be us not walking by on the other side, and it would show in Pope Francis's words that we not only dared to dream we could create a better world, but as men and women of faith, we brought that new world into being. Thank you very much.
We've got some questions that have come in, but I'll start by asking you, how have you found the lockdown yourself, Mr. Brown?
I think it's been difficult for everyone, and I think people have got to understand that they have a social obligation to meet all the recommendations that governments have done. I've got 2 teenage sons, and I think for teenagers it's been particularly difficult because it's the age at which they want to meet their friends, they want to go out and see people, they want to be out playing football, or whether it's going to meet people on a social occasion. So I think it's been very difficult for everyone, but we've been very lucky. I feel more worried about people who have been confined to very small flats with larger families, overcrowded, the pressures that then develop. I feel very worried, actually, that the poverty that many children are suffering is being worsened because they have lack of access to the internet, even though we're asking them to do school lessons. And of course, they're still paying connectivity charges, and some still don't have the computers. So for the very poorest in our society, this has been very difficult. And you'll see from the stock exchange that people who are already wealthy have managed to benefit from what is called unconventional monetary policy, but people who are very poor have actually suffered badly. And there's still an issue in the next few weeks about making sure that the universal credit benefits are extended over the next few months. And I hope that everybody can ask the government that actually happen. We've also suffered this huge cut in overseas aid, and that really worries me too, because all the things that we're talking about become impossible if we don't have the ability as Britain to be able to make our contribution to sharing in the vaccination of the world, but also sharing in global health and global education.
If I can bring in Archbishop Leo Cushley now, just to say hello as well.
Yes, hello there, Mr. Brown, or Gordon, if I may. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for doing this. That was a real tour de force. You're talking like a student for the priesthood. You seem to know Catholic social teaching better than anyone I've met outside of a seminary, but most impressive indeed. But I'm sure that you saw a lot in it that actually translates very well into politics to people of all religions and none. And I picked that up from what you were saying. At least that would certainly be Pope Francis's idea with Fratelli Tutti, that we can all pursue the common good, and that the common good it somehow needs to be restated as something worth pursuing, rather than merely emphasizing the rights of the individual, which are important too. But I was very pleased to see you picking up on that. I wondered, one of the things you mentioned was the conversation between President Biden and Pope Francis. And I think you mentioned immigrants, poverty, and the environment, yes? If you had a choice, Gordon, and you could pick one of them, which one do you think we need to pursue the most strongly of those 3 things? What would you say?
It's so good to talk to you, and I'm glad you're keeping better at
Thank you.
Thank you. You have got a great reputation for the work you've done in all parts of the world, representing the Church, the United Nations and elsewhere. And so it's great we have the benefit of your experience back in Scotland. I'm afraid I would concentrate on the immediate and hope that if we could solve some of the immediate problems, we could then solve some of the bigger problems. Now, climate change, I hope in December, the COP26 conference will see the world coming together in Glasgow. And I think from what President Biden and John Kerry, whom I know well, who's his representative, have said, they really want this to work. But I am so worried about the amount of hunger and malnutrition. You know, there are 7 or 8 times more people affected by hunger, life-threatening hunger today, than by COVID. And a lot of that has been caused, it's doubled. The numbers of people who are facing starvation have doubled because of COVID and the threat that people's livelihoods are faced, and the lack of work and the lack of social safety provision. So I would like us in the next few weeks to think of the G7 that the government's holding in Britain in July, and that we do something big, not just about vaccination, where I've suggested there are things that could be done, but let's deal with this problem of child and adult hunger across the world. Because if we lose so many people through our failure to act immediately, then it's difficult to think of how you can repair that damage. So first things first, and let's, I think, as you would say and the Pope would say, let us think of the poor, and let us not walk by on the other side.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I also would, I must say, I'm sure you're the same, would like to see the government reassure us about the 0.7%. That we were promising ourselves to do in this country for decades, and then we did, and now we seem to be rowing back a little bit, understandably. But on the other hand, I noticed that we are able to find lots of money to prop up the economy here. But I think you were pointing out that a little bit of enlightened self-interest, after all, abroad in other countries, is going to benefit ourselves in a selfish way, but in a good way for everybody too.
Well, I'm pleased you mentioned this, because I'll be honest, I was one of those people who made that commitment to 0.7. And I was pleased it became an all-party, non-partisan commitment that everybody held. And now I'm absolutely shocked by the scale of the cut that's taking place, because it's not just 0.7% to 0.5%, which takes about 3 or 4 billion out of the budget. We are a smaller economy, so 0.5% is a lot less than it would have been a year ago or 2 years ago. So you know that letters are going out to African countries at the moment saying that the British aid budget, at the time that they're facing these awful circumstances of COVID, is being cut by 50%. So they're going to get 50% less money next year, maybe 70% less. Now, I think there will be a debate in Parliament in the next few weeks, and I think people of all parties are coming together to try to say to the government, you really should not pay for the crisis on the backs of the poor of the world. These are the people who are the most vulnerable, the most in need, the most who deserve our help, because the COVID crisis is no fault of theirs. And to cut the aid just at the point that people are suffering most is the most inhumane thing to do. And so, you know, I think we should all come together and press the government not to make that decision. I mean, how can they go into the G7 and say, we're going to do everything for the world's poor as they would like to do, when they're actually cutting by 50% the aid to some of the poorest countries? That means thousands of kids. It's as bad, as I said in an article in The Guardian, which I'm happy to send you, it's as bad as pulling the needle away from the kid's arm and not vaccinating them, or taking the school meal that's just about to be delivered to the kid and taking it away from them, or denying the school gate being open and shutting it on that kid. Now, we shouldn't allow this to happen, and this is not the way forward for our country. And I think most decent people would accept that.
Okay, if I can just jump in, we've got a question from a Sarah Parvis. She says, I was completely convinced and delighted by your vision of vaccinating the world by the end of 2021. Are you suggesting that international charities like Caritas Internationalis, of which SCIAF is part, should take a lead on vaccinating the world, or should it be led by the US, or what?
Yeah, I've had a number of letters from people saying, because I raised this in an article, saying, why doesn't everybody who's vaccinated and who's got some cash of their own, you know, who've got something in saving, why don't they make a donation to the vaccination of the world? And it'd be great if that could happen, because there's hundreds of millions of people going to be vaccinated in the next few months. They have got some money, most of these people, and they should maybe give something as a donation. But in the end, if we're going to get this done quickly, you're talking about $30 billion. Now, that's a small fraction of the British or American economies and what we spent on the rescue operation. And you could get, so America could spend it would come to about $6 billion from America. It would be something like what I think $1 billion from Britain. And you need to have a system, because otherwise you're relying on charity and a begging bowl at a time when you've got an emergency. So I would, if I was Boris Johnson, get everybody around the table and say, what can you give? What can you give? This is your wealth, and this is your share of the world's wealth. Can you give on the basis of that capacity to pay? And then I've got a proposal. You see, if you give guarantees, let's say to an international institution like the World Bank, they can borrow on the strength of these guarantees, and they can create probably 4 or 5 times as much resources by borrowing. And yes, there'll be a small debt at the end of the day, but interest rates are so low at the moment. So you could actually ramp up your expenditures in the short term by front-loading your vaccination and front-load your vaccination. And of course, if you vaccinate everybody now, it's far better than doing 20% this year, 20% next year, 20% the year. It doesn't make sense to hold off. What you should do is do it now. So we've solved the manufacturing problem in a few weeks, I would say, but we haven't solved the funding problem. And that's how I think we could do it.
Well, just before we close with a word from Archbishop Cushley, thanking all our speakers. Here they are. We've had 3 talks so far, including Mr. Brown's, and they're now all on our YouTube page, from Bishop Philip Egan, Professor John Haldane, and Dr. Mary Rice-Hassan. Many big thanks to Gordon Brown for his talk tonight, as well as to Archbishop Cushley for organising this. And if I can just ask Archbishop maybe to say a final word of thanks as well.
Of course, thank you very much. First of all, to yourself, Gordon. That was a real tour de force, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. Just too bad we don't have longer to get into some very important matters, but at least we've given them a bit of an airing, just as we did listening to other people, experts in law and ethics, and on the church, on the faith as well. And it's been a very interesting couple of weeks. If the folk out there, if you've enjoyed this, or if you'd like to give us some feedback, please do, and we can see what kind of series of these things we can do in the future if you would like to see a little bit more of this. But in the meantime, a great big thank you to the Right Honourable Gordon Brown and to all of our other speakers, and may you have a very happy Lent. I don't know if you associate being happy with Lent, Gordon, but have a happy Lent if you can anyway. And we will all, and hopefully we'll all see each other in a happier place and in a more humane way one of these days. But thank you very much, and God bless everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.